Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and this is another Ukraine briefing. First thing I'm going to discuss relates to Russia's recent new intermediate range ballistic missile, which obviously they fired in the city of Dnipro and took out the munitions factory producing the Neptune cruise missiles. The Ukrainians have subsequently come out and made statements that they acknowledged this new ballistic missile carried multiple warheads. They claimed it didn't have any explosives on board, so it's debatable what they're inferring. Those very bright flashes we saw clearly making contact with that facility. They said it caused little damage. And subsequent to those statements, the Western media tried to make out that, well, actually, this is what the Kremlin's own description of the weapon used was. Basically, they sent a warning to the West after, obviously, the United States and the UK gave Ukraine permission to fire their missiles, i.e. ATACMS, into Russia. Now, US officials have subsequently come out and stated it was an experimental intermediate range missile. Well, that just comes from the fact it's a new missile, and Russia said they were conducting a test. So, arguably, that's a reasonable assessment. The other thing, the statements have come out and said that the missile was carrying dummy warheads. And again, the damage was limited. And then there was a very interesting statement that said that obviously, yes, this missile was without explosives. There was not the type of explosions that were expected. There was something else, but it wasn't huge. Now, we can't verify this one way or the other. Don't have access to satellite imagery of the site in Dnipro to understand precisely what happened. Maybe it was exactly as the Ukrainians suggested, or perhaps not. But clearly, it is not only a unique Russian missile, but with some interesting characteristics which may be explained by the fact it was carrying dummy warheads, and these explosions were not obviously characteristic of what you would normally see with such a weapon, but I thought it was interesting to mention this. Now, obviously last time we made reference to the fact that obviously the Ukrainians had launched additional ATACMS missile strikes, this time attacking the Kursk region. Recall they used 8 long-range missiles, and the strike fell on the area of the village of Kalino, where the Kursk Vostochny, I think it is, airfield's located. The other point was they also subsequently, in addition to Kalino, also attacked the positions of this S-400 anti-aircraft missile division near the village of Lotorevka. Apparently, 2 shells reached the target. There was some damage to a radar facility. The rest were all shot down by this Pantsir missile defense system. Now, why am I making reference to that? Well, clearly there was an expected and anticipated Russian response. And while we can't give a definitive assessment, it does seem rather interesting that Russia has closed the airspace over their Kapustin Yar missile test site in the Astrakhan region, and that is from today, the 27th of November, until November the 30th. Now, it's been reported that that was the location from where this Oreshnik missile was launched, obviously at this military-industrial complex facility in Dnipro. The Russian Ministry of Defense, of course, stated it was preparing a response to the ATACMS missile strikes on this Kursk airfield. So, if this is being closed for that purpose, then you would logically think the next 2 or 3 days there will be another Russian response. The question is this going to have what the Ukrainians term to be dummy warheads? Or is this going to be an upgrade from the dummy warheads? But certainly I would say with almost certainty it won't be of the nuclear variety, even though it's an intermediate range ballistic missile. But the fact there has been this update does give that implication that Russia intends to act rather quickly. Where the site intends to target remains to be seen, and whether this test will be an upgrade on the dummy warheads, as I said, or whatever other warheads they will attach to this missile remains to be seen, but it's certainly something worthy of our discussion, and we'll follow it up in the future. Another point I want to discuss is a lot of endless statements coming out without any real substance to them. And this relates to things, for example, that Ukraine is going to be given nuclear warheads by the West. This is absolute nonsense. Then there were statements coming out relating to the fact that the United Kingdom and France were going to send basically NATO forces to fight in Ukraine. Now, I've heard that story so many times, particularly in the last year. Some statement was made, some spurious reference, and it turned out not to be the case. Now, firstly, the United Kingdom came out, the Defence Secretary, and said very clearly, we do not intend to deploy any of our troops for combat in Ukraine. We are very clear that we stand ready and continue to support Ukraine with training, but there has been, note, a long-standing position that we are not committing UK troops to the theatre of action. That is certainly the UK position and remains the UK position. We are not committing UK troops on the ground to Ukraine. I mean, there was some reference to a lack of a response to private military companies or UK peacekeepers in the event of a ceasefire. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So there's a little bit of a grey area, but we know for a fact the United Kingdom and other Western countries have had these private military companies and trainers in Ukraine for a decade, effectively, since the Maidan in February 2014. Another point, and this is where I think the reference to the French and the UK sending forces, mistakenly thinking they were going to fight in the Ukraine war, there were suggestions that European countries, and principally perhaps France and the United Kingdom, may dispatch troops to the Ukraine, note, to ensure a ceasefire and provide security guarantees to Kiev. Well, that's not in the present, that's in the future when the war's over. Because the argument is France and the UK could play this role in organising the deployment of troops to Ukraine, but this is where it gets ridiculous, because apparently the Baltic and Scandinavian countries, as well as Poland, may be involved. Germany doesn't seem to want to have anything to do with it. And this really relates to a sort of post-war scenario which, effectively Russia has made its position extremely clear. And the war's over, we're not having NATO peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, and certainly not along a demarcation line that we regard, as we said previously, to be part of what is now Russia since these referendums. So this obviously potentially would relate to Donetsk, less so Lugansk, certainly Kherson and Zaporozhye. Now, with regards to the issue of private military contractors, it's interesting that Europe apparently has resumed discussions about the potential of deploying these. And this has been driven by the fact that there's a belief, well, we're going to have to step up in Europe and do far more because Trump, when he's elected president on January, so the 20th next year, that somehow then the US will scale back support and we've got to step up to the plate and provide that support. The problem is quite a lot of European countries are totally opposed to this idea. And you've got to bear in mind that Macron first made this at a Paris meeting back in February. It got no proper traction then, and one or two countries might suggest it now. But it doesn't mean in any way, shape or form it's going to happen. The fact that the United Kingdom and France are now talking about defence cooperation within the umbrella of NATO, but somewhat independently, and that we want to create this coalition of allies in Europe because the United States might be walking away from the war, is just talk. It's in no way, shape or form indicative of the fact that anyone in France or Britain is going to send any troops from private military companies to Ukraine, even though, the idea has been floating around it's about the best description for what is now nigh on 9 months, possibly even longer. Because you had back in February these 20 Western countries who discussed this amongst other things, and there was absolutely no consensus. The majority weren't interested, and then of course we get this vague caveat, well, it could possibly happen in the future at some point in time. Clearly, if you deploy those kind of forces officially, that's an escalation from the Russian perspective. And this is why it's all just words. It's been words for a very long time. And also, of course, let's face reality here. There has been these kind of private military contractors, as I said, inside Ukraine for the best part of a decade. Just because there's a war on hasn't really changed that in any way, shape or form. So this is not even really a development as such as is being made out by the French. And I think this is just Macron trying to score some political points at home to look like a tough man of Europe, which of course everybody knows is absolutely not the case. And another point worth making is that Russia's reiterated this. There's going to be no freezing of the Ukraine conflict. That doesn't create durable peace. They reject categorically any notion of doing so, whether it's following the idea of a North-South Korea kind of scenario or any other option. I mean, this apart from anything else would be one of those situations where they could freeze the conflict, and then in 2 or 3 months it starts up again, and then they've remobilized Ukraine to whatever extent they can, which is limited. And by that point, they'll be able to give them a significantly larger amount of arms in the process. And then the war reignites. Freezing the conflict is absolutely not a solution. The West thinks it's a partial solution, and it digs them out of a hole on a temporary basis. But in reality, it doesn't do anything other than that. And it is in no way, shape or form a viable option, and the Russians will never accept this. So the West ought to start to become more realistic about its expectations for what's going to happen at the end of this conflict. Another point worth making, just some small operational updates, is Russia is continuing to target energy facilities. The 2 Black Sea ports in Odessa region were targeted. Also, a key energy facility in Ternopil region is almost being completely destroyed. I mean, one of the sort of power facilities that supplies nearly all of the Ternopil region has, as I said, been severely damaged. This is not just a critical infrastructure site, but one of the key facilities in the region. This is a huge problem, and it adds to these power shortages across Ukraine, and it's going to be a serious problem in this region for a long time. There will have to be scheduled power activations and outages, and that would also include the water supply. I mean, so this has been a key strategy of the Russians, particularly in recent months, and they continue to do so. And of course, the longer this carries on, the worse the outlook will be for the Ukrainian people in the winter. And it's also worth noting with regards to this that Russia continues to target military bases, particularly military bases where NATO instructors have been training Ukrainian troops. One of them is in the Ukrainian town of Chugayev. That's another example, and this has been ongoing as well for basically the whole duration of the war. And again, it's strategically targeting sites that they believe will seriously weaken what's left of the Ukrainian military, which is pretty limited. And in general, the prognosis for the Ukrainian energy supply is extremely bad because they're not going to be able to operate normally over the winter months. There's also, of course, the ongoing concerns about where they're going to source gas from in the future. They're also not going to get transit fees if they switch off the gas supply from Russia, which is also going to seriously, of course, impact Europe in the process. And finally, I want to make a reference to these biolabs and the fact that Russia continues to provide data. And recently they provided the OPCW, which is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, with at least 2.5 dozen, maybe 3 dozen diplomatic notes that they say proves Ukraine's use of banned chemicals. They say they continue to systematically use these chemicals and chemical riot control agents against Russian armed forces, civilians, and the leadership of Russian regions within, obviously, the special military operation war within those areas. They said the proof was provided with sample analysis to the OPCW Technical Secretariat for distribution to state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention, as well as the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. So the question is, that was provided in October and in November, which they say provides this proof of the use of banned chemicals by the Ukrainians. So the question is, what are they going to do with this material? How quickly is it going to be processed, and what's going to be the outcome? Well, for now, not a lot's going to happen because there's a war going on. But there is this ongoing issue of biolabs in Ukraine. What were they constructed for? I think it's pretty obvious. What was contained in those labs, that's less clear. Who owned them, who was responsible for managing them, and what was the ultimate purpose of their existence? Well, obviously there's an awful lot of evidence floating around. I remember going back to the start of the Ukraine war, there was Ukrainians who were sympathetic to Russia, who provided huge amounts of intelligence and documents, which I'm not sure where they ever went anywhere, whether they went to the OPCW or anywhere else. But for the last 2 years plus, not a lot's happened in this regard. Maybe it will in the future. But there's no doubt the West has got its fingers all over this. And it is a huge problem, and it may eventually blow up into a huge story in the future. But for now, obviously, a lot of it remains under wraps and no real indication as to when these investigations will be undertaken, and if there is the relevant proof and people or nations are guilty of crimes in terms of using banned chemicals, making chemical weapons, etc., and who knows what else, that justice will prevail. But as the old saying goes, don't hold your breath. And with that, we end today's briefing. Thanks for everyone who supports us, to those who subscribe. Please share, like, and subscribe if you don't. Share what we're trying to do here. We obviously have a big profile on X, over 200,000 followers, and we recently decided to start actually doing something on a regular basis on YouTube for YouTube listeners. And we want to try and grow the channel, and we think we have a bit of a different perspective and a different insight into Ukraine and other matters globally. And our track record proves that, but obviously we're a new channel and not a lot of people currently know us on YouTube. So if you would spread the word, we'd much appreciate that. And with that, I'll say goodbye.